Could the individual detectives are discreetly investigating in the Nancy Guthrie mystery actually be her own child?
With the other parents, but she says, I understand why you guys are out here. Nancy Guthrie was my neighbor.
Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell before we dive deeper, because today we are analyzing the exact sequence of events that law enforcement is currently reviewing, and reviewing it will completely change your perspective on this entire investigation. Initially, the narrative seemed pretty straightforward for the first few weeks, involving a missing senior citizen, a disguised prowler spotted near her residence, and letters asking for millions of dollars in exchange for her safe return. Off the record, however, detectives have been pondering a completely different angle, wondering not only about the identity of the nighttime visitor, but also about who possessed enough intimate knowledge of her daily schedule to strike precisely when she was isolated. That specific line of inquiry is currently shifting the spotlight onto individuals far more connected to the victim than previously anticipated, specifically her relatives, on an evening in the Catalina foothills that started out completely ordinary. Kozan. This area is known for its tranquility, featuring sprawling properties set at a distance from one another, and roads that typically quiet down once the sun sets, which is exactly what Nancy was returning to after enjoying a meal with her loved ones. The 84-year-old matriarch, who also happened to be the mother of a prominent broadcast reporter, thrived on a highly structured lifestyle, and this particular evening seemed to be adhering to her usual habits. Relatives brought her back to her residence, where she headed inside and shut the entryway behind her, while the interior remained illuminated. But then the situation took an unexpected turn. Law enforcement would spend the subsequent hours piecing together the exact chronological order of events by scrutinizing call logs, alarm setups, health device metrics, and video recordings, leading them to a glaring anomaly. The victim's front porch camera abruptly disconnected at exactly 1:47 in the morning, which was not the result of a rolling blackout or a technical malfunction, but rather due to a pair of hands forcibly tearing the device right off the exterior. Authorities managed to salvage partial clips from the feed later on, revealing a terrifying sight of an individual loitering near the entrance in a balaclava and heavy hand coverings, deliberately dressed from head to toe in garments meant to conceal any recognizable traits. This mysterious intruder was clearly ready for action, yet this event served merely as the starting point, since a completely different electronic ping vanished off the grid exactly 41 minutes after the initial incident. The heartbeat regulating device implanted in her chest lost its Bluetooth link to her cellular device at precisely 2:28 in the morning. Detectives zeroed in on this specific timestamp as the most critical clue of the entire investigation, mainly because these medical implants do not just shut themselves down without reason, leaving experts with only a couple of plausible explanations for the dropped connection. Either the individual had traveled beyond the effective range of the paired smartphone, or a catastrophic medical event had occurred, meaning a horrifying situation unfolded at some point during that 41-minute gap. Authorities are now convinced that the key to solving this mystery lies squarely within that short time frame, especially considering they anticipated uncovering evidence of an abduction when they pulled up to the property at dawn. Finding crimson speckles scattered across the entryways was definitely not on their bingo card, yet forensic lab results eventually matched those genetic markers directly to the missing woman. Crime scene technicians analyzed the visual evidence with extreme precision, determining that the physical contours of the splatters indicated they were not just incidental markings or casual smudges, but rather free-falling liquid originating from facial injuries. This specific type of spatter usually materializes following a physical blow or severe trauma, basically proving that the elderly homeowner had suffered an open wound right on her own doorstep. Unearthing this physical evidence brought up a highly unsettling theory regarding the nature of the crime, implying it was never a straightforward hostage situation since extortionists typically try their best to keep their targets unharmed. A deceased or severely hurt captive holds absolutely no bargaining power, meaning the red stains at the scene pointed toward a physical altercation or a surprise complication that compelled the perpetrator to pivot from their original scheme. Law enforcement officers were forced to confront a troubling hypothesis, wondering if the subsequent extortion letters, the bizarre communications forwarded to news stations, and the eerie quiet that settled over the case were entirely fabricated after the fact. Could all of these elements simply be a smokescreen designed to explain away a botched operation, which in turn leads to an even more sinister line of questioning? Who actually possessed the deep-level insight required to orchestrate such a complex hit on this specific woman, keeping in mind that highly coordinated offenses of this nature are almost never acts of pure chance? These scenarios typically unfold when the perpetrator is well acquainted with the target, fully comprehending their daily patterns and pinpointing the exact moments they lack companionship. Delving deeper into her personal affairs naturally steered the police away from random drifters and steered them straight toward her inner circle, proving once again that top-tier detectives always circle back to the core chronology of a case. A solid sequence of events is usually bulletproof, and the timeline in this particular mystery threw up massive red flags right out of the gate, starting with her relatives escorting her back to the property earlier that dusk. Everything seemed completely standard, with the interior lamps glowing brightly and the surrounding streets remaining dead silent, yet authorities eventually figured out that the most crucial moments of this entire saga unfolded inside a remarkably brief pocket of time. Exactly 41 minutes passed between the second the exterior surveillance was blinded and the instant her cardiac implant ceased its transmission, leaving a highly suspicious 41-minute void. The sole individual holding the answers to what transpired during that window is whoever was lingering on the stoop, prompting authorities to painstakingly rebuild that time frame by pulling footage from various residential surveillance systems nearby. Cops scrutinized every automobile traveling down adjacent avenues and hunted for witnesses who might have noticed suspicious activity near the estate, only to hit an incredibly bizarre roadblock. Not a single getaway car linked to the incident showed up on tape fleeing the vicinity, which immediately sparked a fresh theory among the task force regarding how the culprit actually managed to escape the scene without wheels. Did the suspect simply stroll away on foot? Was an accomplice lurking out of sight? Or did the execution go so sideways that the getaway strategy devolved into its own distinct enigma? If a scuffle broke out near the entryway that left the homeowner wounded or knocked out, the entire operation would have spiraled entirely out of control in the blink of an eye. Chaos inevitably leads to sloppy errors, which are exactly the kind of breadcrumbs that forensic teams live for. And this is exactly why the department started heavily scrutinizing every single member of her social network. They looked past the unknown elements and focused on her closest confidants, knowing full well that armchair detectives typically obsess over the idea of a faceless bogeyman. Society loves the narrative of a disguised home invader or an anonymous phantom who strikes from the shadows and vanishes. But seasoned law enforcement officers understand a crucial statistical fact that average citizens overlook. Random attacks are actually the exception to the rule. These offenses are typically carried out by familiar faces, explaining why police always kick off their probes by interviewing relatives, buddies, and anyone else who has a front row seat to the victim's daily existence. This tactic isn't about jumping to conclusions regarding their innocence, but rather acknowledging that these insiders grasp the everyday habits that outsiders miss, including exact knowledge of when the target is chilling by themselves in the house. An insider would know exactly which entry points are left unsecured and which lamps stay illuminated, making this intimate familiarity with her schedule an absolutely vital component in this specific investigation since she resided as a solo occupant. Her advanced years restricted her mobility, forcing her to depend on prescription drugs and technological implants to keep her body functioning, meaning anyone aware of these weak points could pinpoint the absolute perfect moment to strike without resistance. Acknowledging this dark truth compelled the authorities to confront a terrifying prospect, questioning who actually possessed the granular knowledge of her habits required to pull off an operation that played out flawlessly. The individual responsible for blinding the surveillance system showed absolutely zero hesitation or unfamiliarity with the home's architecture, opting instead to march straight up to the lens, shroud it from view, and rip it down. You don't see that kind of confidence from a drifter who just stumbled onto a random lawn. but rather from a highly calculated individual who knew exactly what they were searching for long before they ever set foot on the grass. The moment detectives entertained that theory, their focus organically shifted to the inner circle, the folks intimately involved in Nancy Guthrie's day-to-day routine. And yes, that meant her relatives. As the probe expanded, law enforcement fell back on a standard playbook for these kinds of mysteries. Authorities started dissecting every single word spoken publicly about the ordeal. We're talking broadcast interviews, press conferences, and televised appeals for help. More often than not, these outcries are just pure heartbreak and shock. Yet every so often, cops pick up on red flags, tiny discrepancies, narratives that morph ever so slightly down the road, or slip-ups that accidentally spill undisclosed facts. Looking at the Nancy Guthrie mystery, her relatives went on camera to beg the public for assistance. They desperately urged anybody holding onto a tip to reach out to the authorities right away. Relatives implored whoever snatched Nancy to just release her unharmed. On the surface, those pleas felt incredibly raw and genuine. Off camera, though, detectives were busy scrutinizing the chronology buried within those emotional appeals. Profilers weighed the televised narratives against the tangible clues pulled from the crime scene. That led them to wonder about one crucial thing. Was every single beat of their story actually syncing up with the cold, hard facts? See, if seasoned cops know anything at all about convoluted mysteries, it boils down to a simple reality. The real story almost never stays buried for good. Sooner or later, the sequence of events, the physical proof, and the testimonies will either interlock flawlessly or totally unravel. Once things start falling apart, detectives really turn up the heat. Now, perhaps the wildest twist in the Nancy Guthrie file revolved around the extortion demands. Normally, an abductor reaches out straight to the victim's loved ones. The bad guy opens a line of dialogue. Then, they set up a drop-off protocol to secure the cash. On top of that, suspects usually offer some sort of proof of life. Here, though, things took a bizarre turn. The threat letters were blasted out to the press, local news channels, and journalism hubs, with the author demanding a payout of millions in crypto. Right off the bat, it felt like something out of a Hollywood thriller. Still, agents immediately caught onto a glaring red flag. The relatives literally had zero means of replying. There was absolutely no callback digit, no digital inbox, and zero guidelines on how to hand over the funds. Simply put, these letters spun a narrative of an abduction while completely blocking any chance to bargain. To veteran agents, that glaring omission sparked a rather chilling theory. Could it be that the whole extortion angle was never actually about a payday? What if the whole point was to throw the cops completely off the scent? Think about it, if the culprit's main goal was to send detectives chasing ghosts, staging a fake hostage situation would do the trick perfectly. A stunt like that easily shifts the spotlight onto some nameless boogeyman, pulling the heat off anybody genuinely intertwined in Nancy Guthrie's personal circle. Over the following weeks, law enforcement kept stacking up the clues, running genetic profiles, processing lab work, chatting with bystanders, and sweeping for cyber footprints. Every fresh breakthrough painted a slightly clearer picture of the chaos that unfolded that evening. Even with a mountain of clues, the task force kept circling back to one core mystery. Why target Nancy? Usually, hostages are picked for a specific motive: cash flow, bad blood, a crime of convenience, or straight-up payback. Now, Nancy Guthrie was hardly some rich celebrity, yet somebody in her immediate orbit definitely fit that bill. We're talking about her kid, Savannah Guthrie, a wildly famous anchorwoman known all across the country. To the authorities, that detail cracked the door open to an entirely different angle. Could it be that Nancy was never the actual mark? Was she simply snatched up as leverage against her high-profile daughter? Profilers actually have a term for this. It is called proxy targeting. It happens when an offender cannot get to their true enemy, so they go after a loved one instead. However, that hypothesis still had a pretty massive hole in it. Assuming this was really a strike against Savannah Guthrie, the attacker would have needed incredibly intimate knowledge regarding Nancy's world, her floor plan, her daily habits, and her weak spots. As detectives dug further down the rabbit hole, they started wrestling with a deeply unsettling thought. Did the perpetrator scope out these details from afar, or did an insider feed them the intel? Well into the probe, a handful of clues surrounding the Nancy Guthrie file are still baffling the experts. For starters, let's talk about that front porch surveillance lens. The intruder who crept up on the property clearly had the security layout memorized. They marched straight to the lens, smothered it, and knocked it offline in a matter of seconds. You just do not see that level of accuracy by sheer luck. A move like that strongly implies the culprit either hung around the yard previously or did some heavy reconnaissance. Next up on the list of weird clues is the heart monitor transmission. Right at 2:28 in the morning, the Bluetooth link tying Nancy Guthrie's cardiac device to her mobile went completely dead. To the task force, that specific minute is arguably the biggest smoking gun on the timeline, proving that the nightmare inside the residence had already concluded. Adding to the grim puzzle were the red stains found outside the front door. Crime scene techs ran the genetics and confirmed those tiny splatters belonged to none other than Nancy Guthrie. Lab experts argued the spatter layout points to a busted lip or a bloody nose, hinting she took a quick hit during a struggle. Sure, every single trace offers a glimpse into the tragedy, yet none of them independently crack the whole mystery wide open. That is exactly why the authorities keep hammering away at the solitary thread, binding it all together, the chronology. Whenever they step up to the mic, cops play their cards incredibly close to the vest. They steer clear of wild guesses. They refuse to drop any suspect names. Most importantly, they lock down any intel that might tank the whole operation. Behind closed doors, though, investigators juggle a bunch of different scenarios simultaneously. A major working theory in the Nancy Guthrie dilemma hinges on a pretty dark idea. Could it be that the midnight raid was never supposed to be an abduction in the first place? Imagine if it kicked off as a totally different beast, like a heated argument that spiraled way out of control, a botched scheme, or a scenario where an insider never anticipated things getting so deadly. Should things have played out that way, the perpetrator would desperately need a cover story to justify Nancy Guthrie vanishing into thin air. Faking a hostage situation checks that box flawlessly. A stunt like that sells the illusion of a home invasion. It points the finger at some phantom prowler, effectively dragging the cops' radar away from the folks living right under Nancy's roof. Law enforcement hasn't officially stamped this hypothesis, though it remains a top-tier angle they're actively digging into. After all, in tangled webs like these, the actual facts usually lurk just beneath the manufactured alibi. Perhaps the most maddening part of the Nancy Guthrie manhunt is the sheer mountain of clues they've got, yet barely any of them paint a clear picture of the incident. The task force has wasted weeks putting the same chain of events on an endless loop: the disguised shadow on the steps, the exact second the feed cuts to black, and those 41 minutes before the heart monitor flatlines. Every single one of those beats is locked into a sequence that agents have scrutinized until their eyes bled. You see, when detectives tackle these brain teasers, they're typically hunting for just one sloppy error. They're looking for that split second where the bad guy went off script. Perhaps they lingered a bit too long on the property. Maybe they dropped a piece of gear, or maybe they slipped into the frame of a neighbor's security lens. Every now and then, that lone screw-up is all it takes to blow the lid right off the mystery. That is exactly why the forensics team won't stop tearing through every byte of cyber data linked to the evening Nancy vanished. We're talking cellular pings, surveillance clips, and GPS coordinates. The hope is that buried deep in those logs lies a microscopic breadcrumb, a footstep, a glitch, a clock punch that finally unmasks the real prowler. The minute authorities lock onto that puzzle piece, the whole confusing chronology might just click into place. Yet, for all the hard evidence gathered to date, one lingering riddle still casts a dark shadow over the Nancy Guthrie file. Why this specific lady? Nancy Guthrie kept her head down and lived a low-key existence. She wasn't wheeling and dealing, she wasn't running with a rough crowd, and she definitely wasn't sparking neighborhood feuds. She was just a devoted mom, a sweet grandma, and a woman who thoroughly enjoyed her drama-free days. Knowing that just makes her vanishing act infinitely harder to wrap your head around, since high-stakes grabs like this usually have a solid motive behind them. Greed, a score to settle, a fleeting chance, or some kind of hidden link tying the casualty straight to the aggressor. Detectives fully understand that unearthing that secret tie is normally the golden ticket to closing the book on a mystery. Whenever a victim like Nancy gets singled out, authorities know a clear reason has to exist behind it. Those reasons inevitably point toward human connections. We are talking about folks in her social circle, casual acquaintances, or individuals whose paths crossed hers in manners that law enforcement hasn't quite pieced together yet. This exact reasoning drives the ongoing police efforts to question bystanders and dig deep into the personal ties surrounding Nancy Guthrie. Hidden deep within those personal bonds might just lie the solution to the one riddle haunting the task force. What made Nancy Guthrie the specific target who vanished into thin air on that fateful evening? Right now, the Nancy Guthrie files represent one of the most disturbing unsolved puzzles sitting on detective desks. We have an 84-year-old grandmother vanishing straight out of her personal residence under the cover of darkness. An unidentified suspect in a mask flashes across a security lens for just a second. The hardware gets ripped down entirely. Her medical heart monitor abruptly drops its digital pulse. Then, right there on the front steps, crime scene techs discover blood matching Nancy Guthrie. Every single clue whispers a fraction of the terrible events. Yet whenever the authorities attempt to assemble this jigsaw puzzle, massive chunks of the image remain missing. Law enforcement professionals have scrutinized the chronology relentlessly, zeroing in on the incredibly tight gap between the security feed dying and her medical implant cutting ties with the mobile app. 41 minutes. That represents the total time frame during which authorities suspect the whole nightmare went down. Inside that 41-minute span, a sinister plot was executed. Whether we are dealing with a premeditated abduction, an argument that spiraled out of control, or a wild scenario the cops haven't even dreamed up yet, that specific window locks away the secrets of what truly occurred inside the Guthrie residence. For the detectives working the beat, investigations of this nature typically hinge on a single overlooked fact, a tiny error by the perpetrator, a buried data point, or a bystander finally recalling a supposedly trivial memory. Tiny breaks like these have cracked thousands of cold files historically, and the precinct remains confident a similar breakthrough will occur in this situation. After all, absolute perfect crimes simply do not exist without leaving some kind of trace. A random local might have spotted a strange car cruising down those suburban streets after dark. A friend might suddenly realize a coworker started acting incredibly suspicious in the week following the vanishing. Furthermore, buried deep within the gigabytes of cyber data hoarded by the forensics unit, a smoking gun might already be sitting there waiting for discovery. Until that breakthrough drops, the dark cloud hovering over this missing persons case will keep terrorizing the entire community. Loved ones are still desperately praying for closure. The police force refuses to stop hunting for any shred of proof that could decode the horrors of that silent Arizona evening. Yet one absolute truth stands firm. Out in the world right now, a specific individual holds the dark secrets regarding the fate of Nancy Guthrie. Once those facts finally break into the light of day, the 41 minutes the task force has been obsessing over will ultimately expose the horrific tale they have kept buried this whole time. Stories like the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remind us that behind every headline is a human life, a family, and a community searching for answers. An elderly woman living a quiet life should represent safety, dignity, and the peace that comes with age. When that sense of security is shattered, it forces all of us to reflect on the responsibility we share for protecting one another. One of the most powerful lessons from cases like this is the importance of awareness and compassion within our communities. Crimes rarely happen in isolation. They often leave behind small clues, overlooked moments, or memories that only neighbors, friends, or bystanders might hold. A single observation, a strange detail remembered days later, or the courage to speak up can sometimes become the key that helps investigators uncover the truth. This story also reminds us to value and protect the vulnerable people in our lives, our parents, grandparents, and elderly neighbors. Their routines may seem ordinary, but their safety depends on the watchfulness and care of those around them. Justice often takes time, but truth has a way of surfacing. As long as people remain willing to pay attention, to care, and to come forward with what they know. Even the darkest mysteries can eventually be brought into the light.